Hi Abhinav, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Just give me a minute.
Okay.
Hi, can you see me? Can you see my screen share as well?
Yes, I can. Just wanted to make a request. In one of the classes you had shared about GST. वो अगर आप सेबी ग्रुप में भी शेयर कर देंगे ना अच्छा रहेगा. Manash is our coordinator. If you can share it with Manash, it will be good because we
Yeah,
didn't receive
no
it.
problem. No. As it's anyways available with Pratikesh, so
It's available with Pratikesh. Acha. So can Pratikesh would request Pratikesh to share it in the SEBI group as well if that's okay.
yeah, not an issue.
So Pratikesh, can you share it with the SEBI group? So I hope he hears because we have not got it. So
Cool. I'll probably have it on my laptop somewhere. I'll send it across.
okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Abhinav. Thank you, Pratikesh.
Yeah, so should we begin for today?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so today we're going to focus on primarily economics. So today's video can be a little technical. So I'm taking only two big topics in economics and one small topic. So if you guys have any doubt, please feel free to stop me in between because these are two things that you need to understand. Now, generally, one would assume that they would not ask you a lot of technical questions from the field of economics. But in your very first CLAT paper, they had talked about NTRO or long-term repo operations, right? So generally, it's not expected for a 17-year-old to understand how the money market works or how your RBI makes a lot of policies to, let's say, address the issues of market liquidity, etc. But it's in the first CLAT exam itself that they asked an LTRO-based question. So I am sort of being forced to share and talk about some detailed topics in economics. Okay. Uh, so let's not start with economics. Let's start with a very simple topic, which is the new oil deal. Okay. So there was a problem between the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and most of these countries had led to overproduction of oil. So what had happened is because these countries were generally not coordinating with each other and they were trying to outbid and outrun each other, therefore they started producing a lot of oil in the oil and access. Now it's a very simple fundamental of economics, so that if there is an additional supply and the demand range remains the same, therefore the price of the good or the commodity will reduce. So both these countries ended up suffering losses, and then all these countries, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and other OPEC nations, I will talk to you about what the OPEC is. They have now finally, I mean, not now, in July, they finally reached an agreement wherein they said that let's now try to regulate the oil that we're producing, right? Because oil is a finite commodity, and not every nation in the world has enough oil so that they can impact the oil markets. But there are certain nations which have about 50 to 60% of the tradable oil markets. And if these guys can somehow form a cartel and they can limit the amount of oil that they're producing every day, and the demand being same, which is projected to rise over the years, the price of oil can then be positively manipulated by them for their benefits. Okay. So let's try to look at how crude oil prices work and what are these OPEC plus nations. Okay. So as we all know, crude oil is a prominent global commodity and there is skewed global distribution. So it's not uniformly distributed. There are some countries that are just lucky to have enough oil under them, and therefore these countries are able to just sell oil and then run their economy based on solely oil. And that's the reason why crude oil is also known as the black gold. Okay. Now, OPEC is the biggest grouping of such countries. There are about 13 members in the OPEC, okay, oil producing nations, and their secretariat is located at Vienna. Now, none of these countries are located in Europe. All these countries are outside of Europe. But generally, if you look at a lot of United Nations organizations or if you look at a lot of multilateral organizations, they generally have their secretariat and main offices, etc., in Europe and primarily in Vienna. Okay. So they have their executive organ, which is the Secretariat, which is located in Vienna, and OPEC has 13 members. Okay. Now, why OPEC is important and why they are able to influence global oil prices is very simple. In terms of total production, OPEC countries amount to about 40% of the global oil production and 60% of international trade. Now, why this jump in 60% is because there are a lot of other oil producing nations as well, for example, the US, etc. But they have enough internal consumption of this oil. So a lot of these countries like the US, etc., for example, they don't sell oil on the global market, and therefore this 40% production amounts to 60% of the international trade. Now, in 2016, the crude oil prices fell, and there were other non-OPEC countries. So there are 13 countries that are OPEC nations, and there are 10 other countries that also produce substantial oil. So they also signed an agreement, which is known as the Declaration of Cooperation, and then they worked with OPEC jointly to work towards stabilization of oil prices. Basically, all of them agreed कि अब हमारे पास एक finite resource है. If we overproduce this good, then what's the point? We'll have to sell it at cheaper. So now they have finally entered into an agreement, and now they have completely regulated the supply or the production of oil. So this new grouping, which is basically the 13 oil countries, OPEC countries, and 10 non-OPEC countries, are now known as the OPEC Plus or the Vienna Group. Okay. Now, a little bit about OPEC, just in case there's a question on OPEC, you should know what are the countries that are members of the OPEC. I forgot to mention it in this slide, but a basic Google search will help you. You should know that it came out as a result of the Baghdad Conference in 1960. Okay. Now, the primary founding members were your largest oil producing nations in the world, namely Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. And later, a lot of other smaller oil producing nations also joined them. Okay. So that's pretty much that I had to talk about OPEC and oil prices, just to warm you up with some basic economics and international relations. Now, the next two topics that I'm going to discuss with you, please feel free to stop me in between. There will be some technical terms thrown here and there, and I will try my best to explain those terms to you. Okay. So the first concept or the first topic that I want to talk to you about is about government securities. Now, recently, I mean, in July, what RBI did was that up until now, what happens is, let's say the government issues some government securities. Let's say the government wants some loan from the market. So it has two options. A, it can go to any bank and probably take a loan from that bank. The other option that the governments have is that they don't want to crowd out investments from banks, right? For example, let's say I am ICICI Bank. I have 100 rupees to let out generally to the market. Now, a large chunk of this money is going to go into a lot of infrastructure projects. Some money will go to retail investors. Now, if let's say I am government of India and I go to ICICI Bank and say, boss, aisa karo, give me 80 rupees ka bond. Now, because the repayer here is the government and the probability of the government defaulting is very low, so the ICICI Bank would be very happy with it. They just say, okay, why not? If I'm paying you 80 rupees at, let's say, 10% interest, then there's a 100% guarantee that at the end of this 1 year, I'm going to get 88 rupees. Now, the government does not want to go to banks all the time, because the moment the government starts taking money from the banks, then lesser and lesser amount of money is available with the banks to give out for home loans, to give out to corporates for their projects, to give out for car loans, house loans, etc. So therefore, this is an alternate mechanism of generating funds by the government. Now, recently, up until now, what used to happen was, because the money market was considered to be, let's say, an expertise dominated market, and you needed some good, decent, formal understanding of economics to operate in this market, RBI had decided that, let's say, let only the mature funds and large corporate houses only deal with government securities. Let's not get the retail investor in, because sometimes it happens such that the retail investor can lose money. But over the years, the government has realized that anyways, a lot of retail investors are entering into the speculative securities market or the equity market. And they have decided that at this point of time, they think that the retail investors are mature enough to understand government securities as well. And technically speaking, government securities is less risky than any other form of investment that the investors are making. So in terms of, let's say, your FD, right, you assume that FD is the safest product on the market. If you make, let's say, if you deposit 10 lakh rupees in your FD account, उसमें market से interest तो कम है. Let's say you could also turn that 10 lakhs into 20 lakhs if you play the market, if you play the equities market very well, but there's no guarantee in that. But in an FD, if you're giving certain amount of money, then after X number of years, you will get your interest back. Now that is considered to be a very safe instrument. Now, government securities is even safer. Let's say I put in money in ICICI Bank when FD kholi. Let's say ICICI Bank goes bust. ICICI Bank becomes zero. Now, then there is no guarantee for my FD, right? But let's say I invest in government securities, then government of India is never going to go to zero theoretically. Because let's say if government of India goes to zero, then your money that you had put in with government of India would be the least of your concern. There'll be bigger problems that you'll have to face. So now RBI said that, okay, I will allow small retail investors, your individuals, to invest in Gsecs by opening these accounts known as gilt accounts, GILT, okay, gilt accounts with central bank under this scheme known as RBI Retail Direct Scheme. Okay. Now, before moving on further, let's try to understand what a Gsec or a government security is. Now, fundamentally, Gsec is a tradable instrument issued by central government or state governments. Okay, it acknowledges the government's debt obligation. Let's say, for example, you come to me and you say, Abhinav, let's say I come to you and I say, boss, please give me 100 rupees. I will give you 110 rupees next year. So I will write this on a piece of paper. Okay. Now, let's say I am an unknown person, right? And so you have a guarantee now from me because you know me personally that, okay, I have given Abhinav 100 rupees today. Next year, wo mujhe 110 rupees de dega. Now that's a debt obligation that I have put on paper. Now, if you go to XYZ and you say, boss, meko 95 rupees chahiye, so I don't have 95 rupees right now. What I do have is an acknowledgement by Abhinav that on this and this date, he will give me 110 rupees. Now, what you do is you will try to convince that person कि भाई मुझे 105 रुपए दे दे and Abhinav will repay you the 110 rupees. But that person doesn't know who I am, right? So he won't trust me. So therefore, my acknowledgement of debt to you will not be a tradable instrument. Now replace Abhinav with Government of India. If Government of India takes 100 rupees from you and says on so and so date, whoever is holding this written piece of paper that I've given, I will give that person 110 rupees. Now the trust exponentially rises, right? Because tomorrow you can go to anyone and say कि boss मुझे 105 रुपए आज दे दो आप 6 महीने बाद तो आपको 110 रुपए मिल ही जाएंगे. So then that instrument becomes a tradable instrument because there's a Bharat Sarkar का ठप्पा on top of that. Okay, so I hope you now understand what a tradable instrument means and what is the acknowledgement of debt obligation. So do you guys have any doubt here or can I proceed?
Do you save taxes in this or no taxes saved in
So
this?
I will come to it. Okay. Okay, so government securities as we see today are of two types. One is your short term and then long term. So as the name clearly puts it, short term treasury bills or government securities are those securities which have maturities of less than 1 year, and long term treasury bills are those bonds or bills with maturity of more than 1 year. Okay. So now, according to the polity that exists in India, central government can issue both treasury bills and dated securities, while the state government can only issue bonds or dated securities, and these are called state development loans. So the states do not have the power to issue treasury bills, obviously, right? Because the term treasury is associated with the central depository of the government, right? So only the central government can issue treasury bills. Both can issue dated securities, and in case a state government is issuing a dated security, it is known as a state development loan or an SDL. Now the benefit of a Gsec is that in theory, yes, obviously there's a chance that government of India goes to zero tomorrow and nobody pays you back. But as I told you, practical likelihood of that happening is very minuscule. So it's effectively a risk-free instrument. So therefore, Gsecs are called risk-free gilt-edged instruments. Okay.
Sorry, is there any meaning of gilt? This gilt-edged? Is there any meaning or just a name?
Not really. These are just gilt-edged instruments based on the accounts that are used to create these instruments. So you need to open a gilt account with the RBI, and because these accounts, you can only trade Gsecs with a gilt account. That's to the best of my knowledge. Most likely that's the case. But I will also check upon this. I never thought to dig deeper here. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
So now let's try to understand what treasury bills are and what dated Gsecs are. So treasury bills are money market instrument, and they are short-term instruments issued by Government of India. And as of now, there are 3 tenures: 91 days, 182 days, and 365 days. So T-bills, as I told you earlier on also, they have a maturity of less than 1 year. So 91 days का भी हो सकता है, 182 days का भी हो सकता है, and it can be up to 364 days as well. Now, the way that the treasury bills work are that these are zero coupon securities and they pay no interest. So let's try to understand what zero coupon is. Now, coupon rate, basically, if you look into the language of the bond market, coupon rate is basically known as, it's the corollary of an interest rate. So let's say I take a bond from you saying that I have taken 100 rupees from you, I will give you a coupon rate of 10%. That effectively means that एक साल के बाद मैं आपको 110 रुपए दे रहा हूं. So that coupon rate is basically a similar sounding name for interest. Now what happens in treasury bills is that treasury bills do not have a coupon rate. They are issued at a discount and then they are redeemed much later at a face value. For example, let's say government of India says, हाँ ये 100 रुपए का treasury bill है. Now what happens is that once government of India comes out with a 100 rupees treasury bill, there is an auction with the RBI through the gilt account. So a lot of people will bid for this 100 rupees ka treasury bill. Now the highest bidder obviously will take that treasury bill and will become the owner of the treasury bill. So let's say somebody says, okay, I will buy this treasury bill at a face value of 100 for 94 rupees. Somebody else will then later come on and say, it's okay, I have made my calculations, I think I can live with buying this at 95 and then redeem it later at 100 rupees. So that effectively means that these are zero coupon securities. इसमें कोई interest नहीं है. So these are traded at a discount depending on the viability of the discount for you, depending on how much liquidity you have to dispose it of your. You might not want to put in all of your money into risky assets. You might have some risky assets and now you want some ultra secure assets. So you're like, ठीक है, मैं 96 में भी ले लेता हूँ because I have so much money in life. What do I do with it? Okay. So this is what I mean by zero coupon securities. Now let's look at the other type of government securities, Gsec, known as dated Gsec. So dated Gsec are basically normal bonds or securities which carry either a fixed rate or a floating coupon rate. It depends on the government or the entity that is issuing them. Somebody can say that, okay, I will give a 5% fixed coupon rate for you. It doesn't matter, dunya idhar ki udhar ho jaye. Somebody else might say, okay, I will give you an interest rate which is floating. Let me peg that interest rate to the real estate market. Let me peg that interest rate to the gold market, or they could come up with any standards as per their convenience. Okay. Now this coupon rate or the interest rate is now then paid on half yearly basis. So for treasury bills, the duration is less than 1 year. For dated Gsec, generally the tenure is from 5 to 40 years. So these are extremely long dated investments, and usually a lot of high net worth individuals or trust, etc., usually they trade in Gsec. Okay.
तो ट्रेजरी बिल में लेकिन वो तो the money gets reduced ना then कि 100 है फिर 95 का आपको बाद में मिलेगा. What is the then point of the retail investor getting it?
No. Treasury bills में उल्टा है ना. So the thing is, the face value is fixed. Let's say the face value is 100. Okay. Now you will auction. There's an auction. There's a first time auction in the primary market. So let's say somebody comes and says, okay, I will buy this at 94 rupees today. Okay. Now this person holds a 100 rupee treasury note or treasury bill from the government and he's holding it at 94 rupees. Now let's say somebody, so you know the market is very speculative, right? Somebody thinks that मेरा cryptocurrency में पैसा बन जाएगा तो I will invest there. Somebody thinks that all cryptocurrency is a scam, मेरे को तो gold ही लेना है. Somebody else might be out there and say नहीं मुझे तो real estate ही लेना है. So these are multiple calculations that people are making. They are thinking, so there might be, let's say, someone who's holding a 100 rupee ट्रेजरी बिल एंड सिंह यार मैं तो फंस गया, मैंने 94 में ले लिया, ये तो मुझे एक साल बाद सिर्फ 100 रुपए ही देगा, सो माइट एज वेल जस्ट सेल इट फॉर 94 और मैं क्रिप्टो करेंसी खरीद लेता हूँ 94 रुपीज की, वो तो 300 रुपए हो जाएगी. सो व्हेन समबडी इज मेकिंग दिस डिसीजन, देयर विल बी समबडी एट द ऑपोजिट एंड ऑफ द स्पेक्ट्रम आल्सो. इज लाइक मुझे स्पेकुलेटिव क्वांटिटी गुड में घुसना ही नहीं है, मैं इसमें खुश हूँ कि मुझे फिक्स्ड है कि मुझे एक साल के बाद अगर मैं 94 के इस इंसान से खरीद लेता हूं, आई विल गेट दैट 100 rupees फ्रॉम गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया. सो दैट्स हाउ द मार्केट वर्क्स एंड दैट्स द बेनिफिट दैट रिटेल इन्वेस्टर्स कैन टेक बिकॉज़ दिस इज अ सेफ्टी नेट, राइट? Now general parlance also says that FD और inflation में कुछ खास फर्क नहीं रह गया. आज inflation, if inflation is at 6%, your FD rate's about 5.5%. So effectively you are losing 0.5% of that money every year. So these are multiple calculations and speculation that people make in these markets, and that's the reason why these markets are also heavily regulated. तो इसीलिए in the beginning government of India and RBI said that we don't want retail investors to come in because हो सकता है they cannot make that well of an informed choice. But now there are multiple other regions which have emboldened the stance taken by the government, and I will come to those reasons in the next couple of slides. And that's the reason why they are okay with allowing a lot of retail investors coming into this money market of T-bills and dated government securities.
Got it. So basically treasury bills और dated G-Secs almost same है, सिर्फ फर्क है साल का. The dated G-Secs are long term 5 to 40 years and treasury bills are 91 day, 182 day और 1 year के आसपास. और वो आपका 100 रुपए में आप लिए तो मतलब 105 हो जाएगा 5% ऐसा टाइप का.
नहीं, वो डेटेड G-Secs में होता है. तो जो आपके ट्रेजरी बिल्स है ना, उसमें सिर्फ इंटरेस्ट रेट कुछ नहीं होता है.
अच्छा.
एक फाइनल वैल्यू होती है.
हाँ.
और उस फाइनल वैल्यू को लेने के लिए ऑप्शन होती है.
अच्छा.
आज मैं आपको बोलता हूँ कि 2022 दिसंबर 1 को मैं आपको 100 रुपए देने वाला हूँ. अच्छा. अभी आप उसको 90 रुपए में खरीदना चाहते हो या आप उसको 94 रुपीज में खरीदना चाहते हो, वो हो गया आपका ट्रेजरी बिल. अच्छा. G-Secs में उल्टा होता है कि आपको 100 रुपए का इंस्ट्रूमेंट है, आपको दे रहा हूं, उसमें इंटरेस्ट रेट है. अच्छा. कि 5% लगा लो, 10% लगा लो, फिक्स्ड भी हो सकता है, फ्लोटिंग भी हो सकता है. गवर्नमेंट से मैं गारंटी नहीं दे सकता 5% की. चलो मैं गोल्ड के साथ पैक कर लेता हूँ. अगर गोल्ड 7% से ऊपर जाएगा तो मैं तुम्हें 7% दे दूंगा. अगर गोल्ड सिर्फ 2% से ऊपर जाएगा तो मैं सिर्फ तुम्हें 2% इंटरेस्ट दे पाऊंगा. ओके. Now let's look at what a gilt account is. Basically, gilt account वो account है which you open with the RBI. Okay. I mean, it's an account which is permitted by the RBI, and that gilt account is used to trade in G-Secs. Now, if you're a person that is resident in India, then your FEMA, all of these regulations don't matter. But if you're a person that lives outside of India, because a lot of foreign institutional investors also invest in government securities throughout the world, then you have to comply with this regulation known as the Foreign Exchange Management Act of 2000. There are multiple regulations framed under it. That's not a concern for your syllabus. I don't know about SEBI, but at least for CLAT, that's not a concern. Okay. Now, one of the reasons why government wants a lot of retail investors to step in and take a step and give money to the government is that they want to financialize the vast pool of domestic savings. Abhi India mein, let's say India in terms of sheer numbers, for example, has the highest number of cryptocurrency holders. 10 crore log India mein aise hain according to this latest data which are holding cryptocurrencies. So the government says ab log mature ho gaye hain, they are investing in speculative instrument, so might as well give these people a chance to look at these other investments as well. और इसमें government का बहुत फायदा है because see, it really doesn't matter to the government in terms of pure money because somebody is going to borrow this, somebody will buy this, either a foreign institutional investor will buy this or a bank in India or any other person will buy it. What the government wants to do is that it doesn't want banks to buy a lot of these because let's say I'm a retail investor, right? And somebody in Bihar wants to set up wants to build a school. Now I am not going to give money to that person in Bihar to set up a school, so I'll just keep it in a bank, and the bank has the let's say wherewithal and the systems in place to actually find people like him who need this money. Now if let's say a bank's borrowing, a lending pool is 100 rupees और उसमें 60 rupees तो government ही उठा लेगा, so banks at the end of the day, because they also have to maintain profits for their shareholders, they also can't take those risky decisions. So they'll say कि अगर मैं इसको 50 रुपए दे देता हूँ, गारंटी नहीं है कि इसका स्कूल बनेगा नहीं बनेगा, what if he goes bust or what if he pulls a Vijay Mallya on me, फिर मैं क्या करूँगा, what do I tell my investors, what do I tell my shareholders? So banks also take the safer route generally and invest in government securities. So now what the government wants to do is that it wants to reduce its dependence on banks. Government को इससे फर्क नहीं पड़ रहा कि पैसा उन्हें कितना मिलेगा, they will still get the same money. The government is just working at the source of the money. If banks do not provide this money, if a lot of retail investors provide this money, then some banks might have to lend money to this person who wants to start a business in Bihar. So that's the sort of benefit that the government is looking at, and therefore they're looking at financialization of a vast pool of domestic savings. Because देखो इंडिया में सबसे बड़ा इशू है, a lot of people don't invest in the market because they think it's a scam. अभी हर्षद मेहता 1992 came out on Sony Live, so most people generally believe that the stock market is a scam. Now if you can buy something that is guaranteed by the government of India and you have surplus money, आप उसे बैंक में मत रख के सड़ाओ, आप government of India का bond ले लो, so therefore a lot of that money will be freed up and it can be put to better use. Okay. For retail investors, it's a win-win deal because now you have something which has the guarantee of government of India. अब government of India पे तो trust करना ही पड़ेगा. who else otherwise can give you this sort of a guarantee, right? Now, and I think someone had asked a question regarding tax benefits. So if let's say you put money in your provident fund scheme, or you put money in national small savings certificate scheme or post office scheme, then you have certain tax benefits in that, and that's like an incentive for you to put in money there. However, if you are purchasing government bonds, there are no tax benefits. Please take note of this, okay? It can be a very simple MCQ question that tax benefits are associated with treasury bills, so your answer would be false. So there is no tax benefit here. Tax benefit is given in your provident funds, national savings certificates if you put money there, but there is no tax benefit in purchase of government bonds, okay? So now let's look at why Gsec, like why Gsec exist and what is the use of Gsec. Now, primarily, a huge use of Gsec is done by the RBI for liquidity management. Now, let me ask you a question. If, let's say, there is a lot of liquidity in the market, is it good for the economy? Kya hoga? If, let's say, people have a lot of money in their accounts, what will happen in theory? Anyone wants to take a guess? What will happen to prices of goods?
Buying power will increase because people will be buying more.
Exactly. So a lot of buying power will increase, but in the short term, the supply of goods is going to be the same. So there will be more money, which is chasing X amount of goods, right? Now, if there is more money chasing X amount of goods, it's a classic case of inflation. Okay? If people are willing to compete with each other, if people are willing to outbid each other just to buy that one book or just to buy that bottle of water, then that's a classic case for inflation. Now, some inflation is good for the economy, but governments and central banks throughout the world, one of the primary jobs is to regulate inflation in the market, right? So let's say RBI says, "Bhai, बहुत liquidity हो गई है, petrol के दाम, मतलब your food prices, oil prices, gold prices, etc. increasing." And one of the reasons is because people have so much money in their hands, उन्हें समझ नहीं आ रहा हम क्या करें, so they're outbidding each other. So in this case, what RBI does, but RBI would generally come into the market and say, "Bhai, बहुत पैसा है तुम्हारे पास, don't buy random stuff. Here, take certain government securities. You buy these government securities, and then you are basically locking in your money. Tab the supply of money in the market will be reduced, and therefore you will have lesser amount of money chasing the same goods. And that is one way in which inflation can be controlled. Now let's look at the opposite scenario. People don't have money. Okay, like people just don't have money, and the government and the RBI also want people to spend, but the people are not spending money. So what can RBI do in this scenario? What the RBI can do is RBI will step into the market and say, "यार तुम पैसे नहीं खर्च करते. I think you have become very comfortable with holding these secure instruments. So come, let me buy some government bonds from you." So the moment RBI buys these government bonds from these people, now suddenly they have money in their hands. अभी वो government bond तो नहीं ले सकते because RBI has purchased these bonds. Now these people will start spending this money. Now increased spending will have a money multiplier effect, and therefore there will be a general uptick of the economy. So this liquidity management, wherein RBI regulates the liquidity market by buying and selling government bonds, is known as open market operations. Okay, so this is what is termed as OMOs, open marketing operations. Your NTRO is also somehow related to this, and I'll come to that in the next slide. Okay, so this is the primary purpose of Gsec, which is, as in one of the purposes of Gsec is that it is used by the RBI to regulate liquidity in the market. So the next thing, as I told you, it's a potentially risk-free investment. मतलब sovereign guarantee है. Government of India is guaranteeing it to you. आप मुझसे आज बॉन्ड ले लो, इस डेट को आपको इतना पैसा या इस डेट को आपको इतना इंटरेस्ट मिल जाएगा. So for a lot of retail investors, safety is primary, right? अगर आपने लाइफ में पूंजी कमाई है, 50 years old, you spent 35 years working, then you don't want to invest that money in a risky or a speculative, let's say, business or an enterprise. You'll say, ठीक है, बहुत पैसा है, my life is good, I have planned ahead, in 20 years time, I only need this much money, so let me buy dated Gsec for 20 years. So then that effectively gives a lot of avenues for risk-free investment to buyers. Now then Gsec also give you flexible investment options. आपको 90 दिन के लिए आपका पैसा है. Let's say you have a marriage function in 185 days. Now instead of keeping that money in your bank account and not earning any money of it, what you can do is, यार मैं 182 days का let me buy a treasury bill at least I will make some money. 2-3% money I will make. It's better than just letting it sit in my bank account. So effectively, rather than losing money, by investing that amount of money in a, let's say, a treasury bill of tenure 182 days, when you realize कि 6 महीने बाद शादी है तब तक तो मुझे ये पैसा नहीं चाहिए, you can actually make some more money and then probably spend some more money for your wedding. Okay, so this gives a lot of flexible investment options. आपको 90 days के लिए करना है, 180 days के लिए करना है, 1 साल के लिए करना है, 5 साल के लिए करना है, 40 साल के लिए करना है, you can do all of that, right? So then obviously these yields are also fairly attractive. So you have state development loans, and then there are special securities like oil bonds, Uday bonds, Discom bonds, etc. Probably we'll talk about these instruments at a later date, because I want to discuss discoms with you, because we generally have a power shortage problem in this country, and it's very likely that they will ask you a question about discoms in general. And when we are talking about discoms, etc., discoms are distribution companies. We'll talk about discom bonds, Uday bonds, etc. at that point in time. Now another
what is the full form of this UDAY bond?
Yeah, Uday is Ujala something. I'll talk to you about this when I come to discom. So this is related to the power sector.
Okay.
So Uday bonds and Ujala bonds and all of these are something that I will cover in probably the next 6-7 lectures when I talk about the power market in India. Okay.
So retail investors can now invest in these the oil bonds, Uday bonds, and Discom bonds.
As of now, only in Gsecs and SDLs, because they have come up with Gsecs and SDLs. Now it's expected that Government of India and RBI will further ease out your oil bonds and Uday bonds, etc. as well.
Oh, so these are special. These are not Gsec or.
So these are a category of Gsecs in the sense that your oil bonds are also having a sovereign guarantee, right? And your discoms are also mostly state-backed entities.
Right,
so
right.
The modalities have to be worked out. In effect, it's a sovereign loan, but there's a concept of separate legal personality, right?
Okay.
So a company technically is a government company, but that's not Government of India.
Right, right.
Okay. So all of these modalities will have to be worked out. Okay. Now, another very simple thing with Gsecs is that the settlement mechanism is very simple. It works on a delivery versus payment mechanism, which basically means that the moment you give money is the exact time when that bond is credited to you. So the settlement period is nil. Now, the issue of settlement becomes very interesting. Let's say I am a share broker, right? I'm going to give you an example of the equities market. So let's say I am Motilal Oswal. Okay, I have set up a company. Now in the share market, the settlement period used to be T plus 2 days. Now SEBI has come up and said we will reduce the settlement period to T plus 1 days. T plus 2 days effectively means, let's say if I am buying a bond, let's say a share on Monday, then I will pay on Monday. Then there will be a settlement process for 2 days, and those shares will be reflected in my account on, let's say, Wednesday. Now what can happen in between? Settlement mein Motilal Oswal bhag gaya. Okay, or some small time broker, Motilal Oswal nahi jayega as a big broker, but let's say there's a small share broker jo 10-15 लोगों के साथ deal करता है, and that guy runs away. Now that is a settlement issue. That's a settlement risk. So that also adds on to the fact that stock markets are risky, right? And that's why people say that please go with a reputed broker, because at the end of the day, what is the difference between a bad broker and a good broker? Like at least the price of the share is going to be the same irrespective of who your broker is. It's only the commissions and the guarantee that if I'm paying this broker this much money, this share will be credited to me, right? So with Gsecs, you have a very simple delivery versus payment mechanism, which eliminates all the risks. Spot payment hota hai, and on the spot itself, these Gsecs will be credited to you. So therefore, the settlement risk is mitigated. Now, this is also something in line with RBI's thought that बहुत सारे लोग market में invest नहीं करते हैं because of multiple risks. Settlement risk being one of them, and therefore the RBI is trying to reduce this settlement risk as well. Okay. Cool. So now let's try to look at what is the procedure for issuing these Gsecs. Okay. So generally, अब Gsecs is something wherein the government of India decides कि हाँ भाई मुझे इस टाइम पे उतना पैसा चाहिए होगा. Now government of India पैसा जब उठाती है वो whim पे नहीं उठाती है, right? Government of India plans, उसीलिए budget होता है. There's a budget speech जिसमें expenditure होता है, जिसमें पिछले साल की collection होती है, and there's a planning in general, right? So the RBI consults the government of India and they give out half yearly auction calendars कि अगले 6 महीने में government of India will be issuing X amount of government securities at this rate, and this is going to be the tenor of those securities, etc. And they also tell when these auctions are going to take place, so you can hold your money and get ready for these auctions. Okay, then on the date of these auctions, Gsecs are issued through auctions that are conducted by RBI. Now there is a specific electronic platform called eKuber. Now eKuber is the core banking solution platform of RBI. Now if you guys are familiar with banks, you should realize that today everything works on software, right? So there are a lot of CBS solutions for multiple banks. Now one of the CBS solutions which the central bank of the country or the RBI uses, that core banking solution is known as eKuber. Okay, now it's not that only members of the eKuber platform can participate in the primary auction. You also can participate in the primary auction. This applies to not to retail investors, but to other mature and FIIs, etc. They can come through scheduled commercial banks, which are also called as primary dealers. So let's say ICICI Bank is one primary dealer. Let's say I am an American person. I have an account with Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, but I want to invest in government securities in India. Now I am not on eKuber, so therefore I'm not even a retail investor in India, but I still want to invest. What I can do is I can go to some bank which is a primary dealer bank, which will be on the list of the primary dealer banks issued by the RBI. And I tell them that, boss, RBI trusts you, so I should also trust you. Here, take 100 crore rupees and please buy government securities worth 100 crore rupees in my name. So these entities that can do this are also known as primary dealers. Okay. Now, does anyone know the difference between a primary market and a secondary market?
Primary market is basically the IPO, and secondary market is once the shares are listed and then you're trading, buying for the broker. It's secondary market.
Yeah. So in equities market, primary market is जब IPO में listing होती है, that is the primary market. Once those shares are with you and then you can buy and sell easily, that becomes the secondary market. So similarly for Gsecs, when there is an auction at the first place, this auction that I'm talking to you about, this is the primary or market of the Gsecs. Once I acquire Gsecs through that auction, then I can buy and sell these Gsecs based on my requirements in the secondary market. Okay. Now there is an agency known as the Clearing Corporation of India Limited, CCIL, which is the clearing agency for Gsecs, which basically means that it acts as a central counterparty, right? So let's say, for example, BSE or NSE, right? That exchange is a central counterparty, right? So I don't know who I am buying Tata Motors ka share from. I just know that I'm buying the share from someone. And when I sell my shares, I don't know who I'm selling my shares to. I just know that I am selling my shares. Now that counterparty to both of us is going to be the National Stock Exchange or the Bombay Stock Exchange. Similarly, in your Gsecs, the counterparty is the CCIL. So it acts as a buyer from one person and it acts as a seller to the other person. So directly there is no correlation. There is a trustworthy party in between who everyone trusts, and that becomes the central counterparty. So your CCIL or the Clearing Corporation of India Limited is the central counterparty for your government securities. Okay.
Sorry, can you just explain that primary market of the Gsecs?
Okay. So you understand the primary market and secondary market in equities?
Yes, yes.
So IPO is initial public offering, right? That's the first time that those shares become available to the public.
Right, right.
So that's the primary market here.
Right.
Now I told you the process for acquiring Gsecs is through the auctions conducted by RBI. So for the first time when an auction is conducted by an RBI, that is similar or it's a corollary to the IPO. That पहली बार आप RBI के ऑप्शन से ही Gsec उठाओगे, उसके बाद आप किसी के साथ भी खरीद बेच सकते हो.
तो ये पहली बार आपको eKuber प्लेटफॉर्म पे मिलेगा और ये सिर्फ मिलेगा जो FII और जो कमर्शियल शेड्यूल्ड बैंक से इन्हीं को सिर्फ मिलेगा. इट विल नॉट बी फॉर. गॉट इट. और फिर
so eKuber पे आपको मिलेगा if you are registered with eKuber. There are some members who will not be registered on eKuber. They can go through primary dealers or scheduled commercial banks. जैसे फॉर एग्जाम्पल आई एम बिल गेट्स, राइट, एंड आई वांट टू बाय गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया सिक्योरिटीज. मैं नहीं होऊंगा eKuber पे रजिस्टर्ड. सो आई विल कॉल अप ICICI बैंक एंड आई विल आस्क देम कि भाई मुझे गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया का सिक्योरिटी लेना है. ऑब्वियसली मैं eKuber पे नहीं हूं, पर तुम प्राइमरी डीलर हो, यू आर अ शेड्यूल्ड कमर्शियल बैंक, तो तुम तो eKuber पे रजिस्टर्ड हो, तो तुम मेरे बिहाफ पे ले लो. ओके.
Okay. So secondary market here would be buying from the scheduled commercial banks. So उनके थ्रू हम लोग को फिर we can get this.
No.
अच्छा
So scheduled commercial bank उन लोगों के लिए जो ई कुबेर पे खरीद बेच नहीं सकते हैं.
अच्छा ये दिस इज स्टिल प्राइमरी मार्केट.
हाँ.
अच्छा तो सेकेंडरी मार्केट इसमें क्या होगा?
सेकेंडरी मार्केट एक बार खरीद लिया ई कुबेर से आपने, एक बार उठा लिया, फिर आपके अकाउंट में आ गया, फिर आप किसी को भी बेचो, तब आपका क्लियरिंग कॉर्पोरेशन ऑफ इंडिया आ जाता है बीच में.
अच्छा
ओके.
तो ये फिर भी रिटेल इन्वेस्टर ले सकता है या सीसीआईएल से या नहीं ले सकता?
ले सकता है. उसमें जो प्रोसेसिंग एजेंसी है वो सीसीआईएल है बस, अदरवाइज परफेक्टली इक्विटीज मार्केट की तरह चलेगा.
अच्छा और जैसे मोतीलाल ओसवाल आपका ब्रोकरेज फर्म है तो वहां पर आपका अकाउंट है, तो यहाँ पर अकाउंट आपका वही आरबीआई वाला अकाउंट, वो गिल्ट अकाउंट.
हाँ, वो आपको चेक करना पड़ेगा बिकॉज मोतीलाल ओसवाल इज अ ब्रोकरेज एक्विटीज फंड. आई डोंट नो इफ दे आर रजिस्टर्ड फॉर गिल्ड सिक्योरिटीज. वो तो बाद में दे माइट हैव एन ऑफशूट एटसेट्रा लेटर ऑन.
ओके.
So as I was going through the money market, and I obviously came across NTRO, and a question has been asked on NTRO. So I thought I'll just take a short time and explain to you what LTROs are. Okay. Now LTROs are a tool under the central bank which provides 1 to 3 year money to banks at the prevailing repo rate. So do you guys know what the repo rate is? Repo rate is? Anyone? ये तो CLAT का previous
आरबीआई सेट करता है जो रेपो रेट.
हाँ जी.
पैसा उठाने का आरबीआई जो सेट करता है बैंक के लिए.
हाँ. So repo stands for repurchase option. Okay. So repo rate is basically the rate at which RBI lends money to banks. अगर बैंक्स को चलो मान लो ओवरनाइट किसी पैसे की जरूरत पड़ जाती है तो सम अमाउंट ऑफ मनी डिपेंडिंग ऑन द रेशियोज दैट दे आर मेंटेनिंग दे कैन टेक फ्रॉम आरबीआई, बट देयर इज अ लिमिट अप टू व्हिच यू कैन बोरो ऑन रेपो रेट. Right? Otherwise, there are other facilities known as marginal standing facility or liquidity investment facility, which is basically a short-term money instrument जिसका interest rate repo से ज़्यादा होता है. So let's say if the repo rate would be 4%, your MSF rate would be 4.5%. I think those are the numbers that are running. We are operating on right now. So another option that the RBI gives कि ठीक है भाई तुम रेपो वाली लिमिट अपनी मीट कर चुके हो, बट नाउ यू डोंट वांट टू ऑब्वियसली borrow money at the marginal standing facility rate because वो 4.45% हो जाएगा. What RBI does is that as a bank they say that you obviously have invested in a lot of government securities. So what I'll do is I will give you the money that you need. I will give you that money on repo rate, but I will take that government security as a collateral. Right? So when government securities are used by banks as a collateral to borrow money from RBI, those are known as long-term repo operations. Okay. So obviously a lot of T-bills won't function here. Generally your dated securities will function because these are 1 to 3 year monies. So 1 year money के लिए RBI obviously एक साल से कम की security तो लेगा नहीं. So treasury bills will not be a part of our LTRO. These will only be dated Gsecs. Okay. Is there any doubt that you have here? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question.
Just for 1 minute, can you just show the previous slide? Just noting down.
Don't worry, I'll share these slides with you.
But we don't get it. Can you just share with?
I'm not on the SEBI group. I'll just give it to Pratikesh and I'll ask them.
हाँ, okay.
You'll get it. Don't worry.
क्योंकि last time मैंने note नहीं किया था, फिर कुछ मिला नहीं. आपने बोला तो मिलेगा. So Pratikesh को दे दीजिए. He will maybe share it in the SEBI.
I'll send it to Monash. Coordinate कर रहा है ना?
Manash को भेज दीजिए. Whatever. Yes, Manash Mandal is coordinating.
ठीक है.
Whatever is okay with you.
No problem.
Thank you.
Cool. So the next. अरे ये आप सभी के लिए तैयारी कर रहे हो क्या?
हाँ, yes, सेबी के लिए.
तो चलो, I'm assuming आप बाकी बच्चों से बड़े उम्र में, आपने ज्यादा पढ़ रखा है. CLAT वाले से पूछ लेता हूँ. Do you guys have any doubts in what I just discussed today? Hi CLAT people, do you guys have any doubts? You want to ask questions?
No sir, all clear.
All clear, excellent. Is there anyone else? Because it's a little complicated. When I was 18, 19 years old, I had no idea this existed. Okay, so good that you guys know this.
So can I get the PDFs or should I just take screenshots of the slide?
As I told you, no, so you are from the CLAT group, right?
Yes sir, I'm from CLAT 2022.
Yeah. So I send it all to Pratikesh and Pratikesh will share these PPTs with you, don't worry.
Okay sir, thank you.
Cool. So now let's look at the next interesting development, which is the periodic labor force survey. So there is an organization known as the National Statistical Office. Now they have released their third annual report on the periodic labor force survey, which means that labor force survey was started in 2017-18. Okay. So let's know what the NSO is. So NSO, or the National Statistics Office, is the statistics wing of this ministry known as MOSPI, और मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ स्टैटिस्टिक्स एंड प्रोग्राम इम्प्लीमेंटेशन. नाउ फॉर क्लैट वो बहुत रैंडम सवाल पूछ लेते हैं कि मिनिस्टर कौन है. सो आई हैव नॉट रिटन इट हियर, बट जस्ट लाइक बिफोर गोइंग टू योर एग्जाम, just go through a list of ministers, because I think they've somehow sometimes asked who is the minister for this ministry. So if there's a question on periodic labor force survey, they might just ask you who is the minister of MOSPI. Now this article I am deliberately mentioning here because I think it's a good article in the sense that it checks two things. पहला तो ये कि आप न्यूज़ पढ़ रहे हो, and the second beautiful thing that this article checks is whether you are understanding the news or not. Data आ गया, ठीक है, एम्प्लॉयमेंट ये बोल रही है, लेबर फोर्स पार्टिसिपेशन ये बोल रही है, वो ऐसा डेटा क्यों है, why there are certain why do sections of people have an opposition to the sort of data that has come up, why is there a certain discrepancy with that data. So that's the second level that's going to be tested when we look at the periodic labor force survey. Okay. Okay, so NSO has the following responsibilities. These are very generic. Basically इस देश पे जो भी statistics निकलते हैं उसकी responsibility NSO के पास होती है. जैसे it's the nodal agency for any development of the statistical system in the country. If you want to lay down certain standards and norms and governances, etc., pertaining to statistics, then NSO takes care of it. Then it prepares national accounts, publishes annual estimates of national product, government and private consumption, expenditure, state domestic product, etc. Now another two very interesting things that the NSO does is that it compiles and releases the index of industrial production. Now this is a monthly index that is released. It gives you an idea कि India के manufacturing sector में हर month क्या हो रहा है. So during the COVID period, this became very important, and it became a huge political issue that PM Modi ji is saying सब चंगा है और सब चंगा सी, but the index of industrial production is showing that we are headed down a very wrong path, because generally the data that otherwise is compiled is based on an annual assessment, right? So if you look at the index of industrial production much before the annual data comes out, you can get a very good idea where your manufacturing sector is heading out to. Okay.
Sorry, ये statistics जो है ये क्या हर चीज का statistics है, जैसे कोविड पेशेंट्स कितने थे इंडिया में, या ये सिर्फ मैन्युफैक्चरिंग का?
So the IIP is the index of industrial production, कि इस देश की जो इंडस्ट्रीज है उसमें कितना प्रोडक्शन हुआ है. Okay. Now next is the so it conducts the annual survey of industries. Now when it comes to the manufacturing sector in India, the most important data set comes from the annual survey of industries. इस देश में कंपनीज कितनी हैं, किस कंपनी का कितना टर्नओवर है, how much tax has what company paid, what is their debt obligation, what are their liabilities, all of that data is compiled by the NSO in the form of the annual survey of industries. So if you want to know कि इस देश के manufacturing sector में क्या हो रहा है, you just have to pick up the annual survey of industries for that particular year. Okay. Now let's look at the periodic labor force survey. Okay. So initially obviously you know, right, we are living in a data driven world, and obviously the faster and the more amount of data that is available to you, that is obviously going to be much better for you in terms of policy decisions, etc., right? So the government also doesn't want to work on stale data from 3 years ago to formulate policies in terms of which sector should I invest money in, what sector can generate the maximum amount of jobs for X amount of money. So earlier on, this data used to be provided by the employment unemployment surveys. But the problem with the employment unemployment surveys were that they were conducted once in 5 years. तो अगर आपको 2020 में कोई पॉलिसी बनानी है, it could be very likely that the data you have with you as government of India is from 2016. 4 साल में दुनिया इधर की उधर हो जाती है, but that data set wasn't available to you. So you couldn't have effective and surgical policies that could address the burning issues in society, right? So the government of India realized that, okay, this is something which is slightly problematic. So NSO was then directed to come up with the periodic labor force survey in April 2017, and this is an annual survey. Okay, so the first annual report obviously came out in 2017-18. It covered the period of 17-18. It was released in May 2019. Then the second one was released in June 2020, and now the third one has come up during July 2021. Okay. So now let's look at what are the main objectives of the periodic labor force survey. So obviously they have to give you key employment and unemployment indicators in the country. हो क्या रहा है, हवाई बातें हो रही हैं कि जॉब्स नहीं है या एक्चुअली में जॉब्स नहीं है, एक्चुअली में जॉब्स हैं, etc. Right? Now what they do is that for obviously you need more specific data for urban environments, because let's face it, life in the cities moves much faster in India than life in rural India. Okay. So for your cities, they have short-term interval of 3 months, and your PLFS comes out for cities every 3 months. And this data is curated on a current weekly status basis. Now, please ignore these terms for a bit. I will cover what exactly this means in the next slide. Okay. Now, then they estimate employment and unemployment indicators in usual status. Okay, for both rural and urban areas annually. So for your urban areas, it is done on the basis of current weekly status for short time intervals, and for your rural areas and urban, of course, it's done on based on CWS or current weekly status in rural and urban areas annually. Now let's try to understand these technical definitions. Only then will you be able to understand what I've been saying. So first is labor force participation rate. It basically means what is the percentage of the people in the country that are in the labor force. What do you mean by available in the labor force? Either working or seeking or available for work. So if I have decided today that भाई बहुत पैसा है मेरे पास, मेरे पूर्वजों ने बहुत पैसा कमा लिया और मुझे काम ही नहीं करना लाइफ में. So even though I might be 20, I am not a part of the labor force because I am not willing to work. I am not seeking work. मुझे चाहिए ही नहीं, मुझे काम ही नहीं करना. So I will not be a part of the labor force. Okay, so I will not be a part of the labor force participation rate. मैं कर सकता हूँ अगर काम करना चाहूँ तो, पर मुझे करना ही नहीं है. Okay, so labor force participation rate is people who are either working or they are seeking work. Okay, then unemployment rate is obviously the percentage of persons that are unemployed persons in the labor force. So unemployment में भी वो लोग नहीं है जो voluntarily घर बैठे हैं, because they are not seeking job. वो काम करना ही नहीं चाहते. It's only people who are looking for work and are unable to find any work. Okay, so the next important thing to consider is the WPR or the worker population ratio, which basically means that what is the percentage of employed persons in the population. So let's say in a country of 100 crore people, let's assume India has 100 crores for ease of calculation, only 40 crore people are working. So therefore the worker population ratio would be 40%. Okay. Now then next comes the most interesting bit, which is the activity status. So when your data is being collected, it is collected based on what is the activity status of that person. So आपको questions पूछे जाते हैं based on activity status when you're collecting that data. So first reference period is the usual status, which basically means that what is the activity status that is determined on the basis of a reference period of 365 days. कि एक साल पहले की सर्वे से यूजुअली आप लाइफ में क्या कर रहे हो, क्या आप यूजुअली काम कर रहे हो या आप यूजुअली काम नहीं ढूंढ रहे हो. ओके, देन कम्स योर करंट वीकली स्टेटस, which basically means in the last 7 days right before this survey is conducted, what is your status. Okay, so usual status is annual. Current weekly status, as the name clearly puts it, is in that 1 week before the survey. Then you have principal activity status. Now there might be some people who have one job and then they do something on the side. So let's say there is a teacher, right? तो उसको the teacher is working for 11 months अपने स्कूल में, 1 महीने का समर वेकेशन है, then he goes back to his village and then he just works on his farm with other people that he might have employed or with his family. So his principal activity status would be that I am a teacher because majority of my time out of those 365 days has been involved in teaching. Okay, so that's your principal activity. That what is your principal activity status. Then you have subsidiary economic activity status, which basically means that usually तो आप कुछ और कर रहे हो, but are you doing something on the side? So for that particular teacher, his principal activity would be that of a teacher, and his subsidiary economic activity status would that be of a farmer. Okay, so I hope these definitions are clear to you. Now let's look at what I was saying. So right, so it looks at employment and unemployment indicators in short time interval of 3 months for urban areas, and this is based on current weekly status. अब obviously if you are looking at a short term interval of 3 months, तो आप current weekly status पे ही पूछोगे. There is no point of asking तुम एक साल से क्या कर रहे हो when you want to compile the data for 3 months. Okay. Now then it uses the usual status principle for unemployment and employment indicators in rural and urban areas annually. जब आपको साल भर का निकालना है, then it makes sense for you to ask कि हाँ भाई पिछले एक साल तुमने क्या किया है. Okay? So this is the main objective of the PLFS. Now comes the interesting bit. Let's look at what were the findings of this latest survey, and this might surprise you. So this survey says that unemployment गिरी है. Basically it means that jobs बढ़ी हैं. Which might be a little difficult for us to understand because like, clearly jobs नहीं बढ़ी है, right? देख के ही पता लग रहा है, but थोड़ी juggling तो सारी सरकारें करती हैं, ये भी करती है, पहले वाले भी करते थे. So let's look at what has happened, and let's first look at what is the survey saying on paper officially, and then we will analyze this later. Okay. So this PLFS says that there is a decline in the unemployment rate and there is an increase in the labor force participation between 17-18 and 19-20. So even though the real growth rate of economy has slipped from 7% growth rate to a 4.2% growth rate, they are saying that number of people who are participating in the labor force have increased and the number of unemployed people have also decreased. Now this is a little hard to digest. So try to think about why this has happened. 3-4 slides later, I'll tell you the reason why this has happened. Okay. So according to this latest periodic force survey, unemployment rate is lowest at 4.8%. In 18-19, they are saying it was 5.8%, and 17-18 it was 6.1%. So this survey says that from 2017 to 2020, unemployment has actually reduced. Okay. Now this also targets a specific group, which is youth, 15 to 29 year age group. Now here they are saying that the unemployment rate is quite high. So a total unemployment rate is 4.8%, but amongst youth in 15 to 29, this rate is 15%. And urban areas ka male and female jobless rate is surprisingly high. 18.2% of urban males, young males in the 15 to 29 age group, and 25%, almost 24.5% females in the urban females in the age group of 15 to 29 are unemployed. Okay. So the worker to population ratio now they are saying has improved to 38.2% in 2020 compared to 35.3% in 18-19 and 34.7% later. So what you have to understand here, what is important is the fall in unemployment rate. Now that's why I have made an exclamation mark here. Okay. Now another interesting thing is that they have shown that there is a rise in the workforce engaged in agriculture. So basically what they're saying is that the share of workforce engaged in agriculture has risen to 45.6% as opposed to 42.5% last year. So can anyone tell me what this effectively means? Can you analyze what this means that agriculture mein log zyada employ ho gaye?
Then maybe because of COVID-19, a lot of people lost their jobs and they shifted from urban to rural areas.
Precisely. You saw a lot of those migrants, right? Overnight, they just had to walk home and they had nothing to do because all the jobs and your wage jobs, etc. dried up. So these people have now gone back home. Now, do you guys understand what disguised unemployment is?
Yes, means like a particular amount of people working on the same land, i.e. there isn't such requirements for that many people, but they're still working.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's say there were 5 people at home. They were producing 100 kgs of rice. Now 2 people came back from the cities. They also went to that farm. Now they are still producing 100 kgs of rice. So on paper, those 2 people are employed, but in reality, their employment means nothing, right? So that is a disguised unemployment of those 2 people. Okay. So this is what is happening in agriculture. A lot of people have gone back home because they have literally nothing to do and they are taking to agriculture at home. Okay, so agriculture is now performing the function of a sink. जहां भी वर्कफोर्स को अच्छा काम नहीं मिल रहा है, they have all gone back home and they have said अब खेती ही करेंगे और क्या करें लाइफ में. Okay, now another interesting perspective that came out in terms of women in agriculture is that in 2018-19 the participation of women was 71.1%. Now it has significantly jumped to 75.7%. Okay, however the problem is that these women are not getting any money from this. They are unpaid family workers. वो बस काम कर रहे हैं खेतों में, उनको कोई एक्स्ट्रा पैसे नहीं मिल रहे हैं उसके. So they are being counted as workers, but the productivity of their job is questionable. Not questionable in the sense that obviously they are contributing to it, because if they were not there, convenience कम हो जाता लोगों का, and they are obviously giving some output, but they are not getting paid for it. वो जबरदस्ती काम करवाया जा रहा है उनसे, कोई एक्स्ट्रा मनी नहीं मिल रहा है उस पर. ठीक है. Now the next thing is rise in self-employment. So according to this PLFS, 53.2% of rural households and about 31% of urban households are engaged in self-employment. Okay. Now this has increased. So rural households reporting themselves as self-employers, especially non-agriculture, went up. So what does this mean?
So maybe because of the different ideas for rural people, that has the different several schemes has been come up from the government to promote self-employment, or we can say small businesses. So thereby.
So have you guys heard of Mudra loans? Okay, so please Google Mudra scheme. So Government of India came up with a scheme and they said that if there is someone who wants to set up an enterprise on their own, we will give you sasta loan, unsecured loan. Okay, they'll give you some unsecured loan. आप ये पैसा ले लो, try to do something. If you make money, well and good. Otherwise, गया ये पैसा. So a lot of these Mudra loans, etc., have been given to people recently to promote the entrepreneurial spirit. एक तो ये reason है. The other reason is, why would somebody leave a comfortable job when they are chilling in a city making money? Now they are being forced to be self-employed, right? अभी क्या करें, जॉब तो है नहीं, तो I'll only have to figure out something. घर पे तो मैं बैठ नहीं सकता. So if even though there is a rise in self-employment and there is a rise in people employed in agriculture, what it really means is that a lot of jobs have been lost, and that's the reason ये self-employment की category में हम आ रहे हैं, right? So in terms of purely data, this obviously, so it doesn't matter, right? Let's say there are 100 people working in a city and 50 people working in a village. Now there are only 90 people working in the city, 10 people have lost their jobs and they have gone back to the villages. Now the data will not tell you anything here. The data will still say 150 people are working, but the reality is that 10 people actually lost job in the cities and now they're being forced to go back. या तो अपना business खोल रहे हैं जबरदस्ती by force, or they are a part of the disguised employment force in agriculture. Okay, so this is how you have to analyze this data. Okay, I hope that's clear to you.
And one question. So this LFPR concludes matlab every sector of employment, organized, unorganized, MNC,
Yeah.
every.
Yeah.
Okay.
So इसमें they just ask people. चले जाते हैं पूछने कि आप क्या काम करते हो, कितने टाइम से काम कर रहे हो. So there are multiple categories also कि आप organized sector में हो या unorganized में हो, but this covers everything. So this data that I'm giving, that the labor force participation rate is 38% or something, that's everything included. Business, jobs, self-employment, agriculture, unpaid work at home, all of that is included. Okay. Now there is an increased female participation. So female labor force participation has increased by 5.5%. Much of this is driven by the increased labor force participation of rural women. Now what do you understand from this? Anyone? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing?
Sir, maybe because the women in rural areas are forced to work in their farms,
Precisely.
and that is why there is such increase in percentage.
So generally, I don't think anyone will disagree that India is a sexist society. आज भी बहुत सारे घरों में ये बोलते हैं ना, अच्छे घर की लड़कियां काम नहीं करती हैं, and all of that stuff still flies in the 21st century. So a lot of women generally don't work. Sometimes they also don't want to work. A lot of times the families are also saying कि सब बढ़िया चल तो रहा है, why do you want to work, right? So now अब सब बढ़िया नहीं चल रहा है. Now they don't have money. So now they're telling women, "Acha, aapko kaam karna tha to kar lo," right? So even though it's a good thing, but it's coming out of a bad way, right? So this is one. I mean, obviously, this is not the only reason, right? A lot of women are also getting empowered. Women have more protection. The security infrastructure is becoming better. There is more equality. A lot of people are preferring to hire women now, right? So all of those things are happening. But one of these things is also a contributing factor that sab changa nahi si. That's why a lot of women are now being forced to work. Okay. And then this PLFR also talks about the impact of the lockdown. So then it talks about only a period of 3 months, right? April to June 2020. They said that the labor force participation rate has declined for men from men to 55%. This used to be 56.7, and for women it has reduced to 15.5 as opposed to 17.3 in the January-March period of the same year. Okay. So on a year-on-year basis, PLFR says that the basically 8 crore jobs gayi hain in urban India, and rural areas mein 1.5 crore jobs add hui hain, right? So most of these 1.5 crore jobs or 14.7 million jobs that have been added, a lot of this is in the category of disguised unemployment. Okay. So unemployment rate also has increased sharply in urban areas. It used to be 8.9%. Now it has gone up to 21%. And rural areas, this used to be 8.7% in January, and this has gone to 12.2% in April, June. Okay. And obviously, the self-employed were the worst hit during the lockdown, and regular wage workers also suffered only in rural areas. Okay. Now let's look at the analysis. So PLFS is generally very controversial, right? So when the first edition of the periodic labor force survey came out in 2017-18, वो शायद उन्होंने ना पहली बार डेटा दिया था तो बहुत honestly डेटा दे दिया, and it created a lot of controversy because this was government of India itself saying that India's unemployment rate had reached a 45-year high. पिछले 45 साल में कभी इतनी unemployment नहीं हुई थी. Now obviously election year था. So the government of India tried to just say, हाँ वो गलती हो गई, this data is baseless, but they couldn't actually say that because they themselves had come up with that data. So they used their propaganda, all of that, G News, etc., which चीजें चलाई होंगी, and then they said, no, this report doesn't make sense. But later on, when the elections happened, they won those elections. They said, हाँ क्या ही फर्क पड़ता? Sorry, we had a very high unemployment today. So this I'm telling you because the PLFS, right from its inception in 17-18, has been very problematic. So the question is, how did the labor force participation and unemployment rates improve in a year when growth has decelerated so sharply? So we've seen, right, that we've gone from a 7.2% growth rate to a 4-something% growth rate. So logically, it's a little hard for me or anyone to understand why has employment risen. Okay. So for that, you have to understand what is the methodology of the calculation of the periodic labor force survey. Okay. So remember, we discussed two things: usual status and current weekly status, right? So usual status is when you ask someone कि आप पिछले एक साल में क्या कर रहे थे, and current weekly status is when you ask someone आप पिछले एक हफ्ते में क्या कर रहे थे. Okay. So what generally happens is that in India, NSO uses the usual status parameter. Now the problem with usual status parameter is that उसमें recall की problem हो जाती है. So let's say you were unemployed for let's say 2 months, right? In the last 1 year, and somebody asks you, so you're unemployed for the last 2 months right before the survey, and someone asks you, आप क्या करते हो life में? Are you unemployed? So then you will say, no, see, I've been working for the last 10 months. It's only that in these last 2 months, I don't have a job. So in the usual status category, that person is employed. But once it comes to the current weekly status category, wherein you're asking आप पिछले एक हफ्ते में unemployed हो या नहीं, then that person is going to say, yes, I am unemployed, right? So globally, in the entire world, your International Labour Organization or your Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, CMI, or any private sector enterprise, which calculates unemployment, calculates based on the current weekly status and not based on usual status, because usual status does not give a true picture. Okay, but what NSO and Government of India does is that they take out this data based on usual status and not CWS. So CWS, please keep in mind, is what is used internationally because that gives you a better estimate of unemployment, but India uses usual status. Now let's look at some data points, and this data is from the labor force survey itself. Ye Government of India ka data. Okay, so if you look at the unemployment rate based on usual status, this is the base. unemployment rate based on usual status. 17-18 में 6.1 था, 18-19 में it came down to 5.8, then surprisingly in 19-20 it came down to 4.8. So now the government is saying देखो unemployment rate बहुत कम हो गया है. But now if you look at the unemployment rate under current weekly status, which is the global norm, then you will see there is absolutely no reduction in unemployment. It used to be 8.9 in 17-18, it's 8.8 in 18-19, and then it's 8.8 in 19-20. Similarly, if you look at the CWS or current weekly status data, then you look at the data from April to June 2029. Now this is when I talk about the peak of the pandemic, and this is when I talk about the youth 15 to 29, where unemployment rate was anyways very high. So here the unemployment rate in April, June, according to CWS, was 20.9%, and youth's unemployment rate was 34.7%. So effectively 35% of the youth in this country, based on the CWS calculation, which generally is used globally, was unemployed. Now, according to PLFS, let's say what was the, so this was 15% according to the usual status that is used by Government of India under PLFS to calculate. So this gave an estimate of 15% unemployment. But if you go to the global standard, what ILO and other countries also focus, it gives you an employment of 35.7%. So double se bhi zyada. Now, this is the reason why a lot of people in the opposition were criticizing the government that you are basically manipulating this data to suit yourself, right? So I hope this is clear to you. This is enough for today's lecture, these two important topics that we discussed. So if you have any doubts, I am here to clarify. I know these slides are a little heavy.
Just wanted to ask you, so ये आपका क्या second या third कितना class था ये आपका?
मेरा क्या
ये आपका third class था या second class था? कितना number class था आपका?
I think fourth है ये. अच्छा
fourth. तो फिर मेरे पास एक्चुअली कोई भी, मैंने से आपका इसके पहले वाला जीएसटी वाला जो था वो सिर्फ अटेंड किया था, और तो मैंने कोई किया नहीं है. तो आप फिर या तो प्रतीकेश को या मनोज को हाँ वो दे दीजिए. तो 4 क्लास का, और वो जो जीएसटी का आपने बोला वो जो मटेरियल जो आपने बोला था, तो 5 चीज आप प्लीज प्रतीकेश या मनोज को भेज दिए ताकि वो अपने सभी ग्रुप में भी वो
जीएसटी का आपने वही वाला देखा होगा ना, इसी वाला करंट लेक्चर का आपने स्टैटिक वाला तो नहीं देखा ना?
नहीं, मैंने आपका सिर्फ ये इसके पहले एक जीएसटी वाला जो आपने लिया था वो सिर्फ अटेंड किया था, और अभी ये मेरा सेकंड है. तो आप बोल रहे हैं 4 किया, तो आप चारों का भेज दीजिए, और वो प्लस जीएसटी का मटेरियल आप भेज दीजिए. ठीक है, थैंक यू.
Anyone else has a doubt?
As you said that there was a lot of disguised unemployment observed in rural areas. So my question was that the contribution of agriculture sector in the national economy has been reduced, or like was there any growth observed, or was just neutral because of the disguised unemployment?
See, your growth in terms of your output. See, when you calculate growth, if you calculate it in per capita terms, then obviously it will reduce. But what we generally use is when we calculate GDP, etc., we use the term gross, right? So gross means overall, gross domestic product. So उसमें इतना फर्क नहीं पड़ा. But employment is a little different from productivity, right? As I told you, एक खेत है, उसमें 100 किलो चावल आ रहा है, तो उसका productivity 100 है. Irrespective of 5 people working there or 11 people working there. So in terms of GDP, that will still be reflected as 100 units. So employment is a little different from that.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Got it.
ये थोड़ा जनरल है, आज की क्लास से नहीं है, कि अपना करंट अफेयर्स और ये कैसे बेटर कर सकते हैं. टू बी वेरी ऑनेस्ट, माय करंट अफेयर्स वेरी पुअर.
अखबार, न्यूज़पेपर्स.
अच्छा, रोज सिर्फ न्यूज़पेपर आपको?
Ideally yes, because see, so there are a lot of these compilations etc. also. Okay, right. But I don't think that quality is good enough.
Okay, just keep reading Indian Express or some newspaper every day.
हाँ, you should. So if you've not read newspapers, Hindu थोड़ा सा tough हो जाता है.
Right.
And वो free भी नहीं मिलता है.
Free में मिलता है.
Free में नहीं मिलता है वो.
Free पे नहीं मिलता.
So you can go for Indian Express. एक तो it's a little easier.
Right.
And it's available for free.
Where?
On their website, like they don't charge much.
Okay. ठीक है, बस पेपर ही आप पढ़ते रहो तो बस ये.
Ideally, so उससे आपकी language better हो जाती है, speed better हो जाती है. See, you can obviously rely on videos like this, but obviously I can't also cover everything, right? जैसे अगर आप कोई कैप्सूल या कोई करंट, हम पहले ही बता चुका ना, हम फ्री वाले हैं, हम प्रो बोनो वाले हैं, तो हम दिल की खुशी से पढ़ाते हैं. So I am going to take 2-3 लेक्चर, हाँ अच्छे से पढ़ा लिए, इस टॉपिक में से कुछ आ जाए तो आपको कवर हो जाए. I obviously can't teach you everything, right? तो अब वो कैप्सूल वाले जो पैसे लेते हैं आपसे, तो वो बहुत डेटा क्रैम कर देते हैं.
अच्छा.
We have to compromise somewhere.
Right.
तो बेस्ट इज, देखो आपका पेपर आपके अलावा कोई और क्लियर नहीं कर सकता, आप ही को करना है.
Correct.
So you have to read the newspapers, you have to put in the hours.
Correct. But newspaper is the main thing.
Main thing, any day.
That's it. Got it.
It has, yeah.
Sir, I have got a e-paper subscription for the Hindu, and I'm from Patna. So there is no Patna, editorial there. There is Delhi, Chennai, and other cities. So which city editorial should I prefer the most?
I mean, I to only read Delhi, so I was going to say here. But I really don't know. Like this is something.
Yes,
honestly, I don't know. But I read Delhi only.
Yeah, sir, I always got confused between Chennai and Delhi. So it's kind of, confusing. So
I mean, if you have time in life, then both. But otherwise, I guess it'll be Delhi.
okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're good now. See you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.